The Radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
I like that opening. I don't know about you guys, but I'm a fan. Hi, everybody. It's your Yaron Brook Show. It's been a while. Thanks for listening in tonight. It's, what is it? Friday. It's Friday night, the beginning of a weekend. We're going to be doing a lot of shows in the next few days. Hopefully, if everything works out, we'll be doing a show every day this coming week, starting today, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then there'll be a long break as I go off and go on vacation for a couple of weeks to Spain, northern Spain, and to Portugal. So I'll take my equipment with me, but I don't know that I'm going to have time and the internet connection to be able to do live shows from over there. We will see. All right, today I've got a few questions, kind of stuff that's been hanging around that I haven't got to in past shows. So we're gonna be dealing with some issues there. Some questions that I've been asked that I haven't gotten to, and then we are going to open it up to Super Chat. So a lot of today's show is going to be dependent on what kind of questions you want to ask. You want to ask questions about politics and economics. You want to ask questions about life, psychology, sex, anything you want to ask. I don't promise to answer, but I will try. And of course, you can use the Super Chat feature to ask your questions. So Super Chat is on YouTube, and if you go to YouTube, if you go to my channel on YouTube, if you're listening right now on Facebook or on Twitter or on somewhere else, the way to ask questions is to go to YouTube, Yaron Brook at YouTube, and sign up for Super Chat and put a buck or two, $10, $100, $1,000 on a question. And of course, the higher the amount, the more likely I am to answer. But I tend to try to answer all the questions. So put in anything you want to ask me on any topic. Today's your opportunity to do it. All right, I want to start with a question that somebody's asked on Facebook, and he's been kind of hounding me via email and other places, saying, "Oh, when are you going to answer this? When are you going to answer this?" So, and I've been delaying because other stuff has been more relevant. So I'm going to do this. So this is a quote from Jordan Peterson. So this is a quote from Jordan Peterson about his view of Atlas Shrugged as literature, as a novel. And so I'm going to read you the whole quote, and then I want to comment on it, because I think the quote is very illustrative of something interesting about Jordan Peterson, something interesting about Ayn Rand, and really the deep difference between the way Ayn Rand approaches issues, approaches literature, approaches heroism, the deep difference between how she approaches the world and the way Jordan Peterson approaches it. So I think it's going to be interesting to go over this quote and talk about it. So and of course, the Super Chat is open. I'll accumulate the questions on the site here so that I will try to answer them as the show today progresses. We'll see how long in the evening we will actually go. All right, let's do this. So this is Jordan Peterson talking about Atlas Shrugged. He says, Atlas Shrugged is not great literature because Rand doesn't place the struggle between good and evil inside her characters. It's always between characters. And that's a mistake, because even your most radical left-wing revolutionary is not a radical left-wing revolutionary, right? So you have to show the struggle within more. And I don't think she does a very good job of that. Her noble people are too noble, and the ignoble people are too ignoble. And it divides the world too much into good guys and bad guys. Now that's comforting. And there is an archetypal element to it too. But it is not sufficiently differentiated enough or sophisticated enough. Okay. So, I hear that commentary on Atlas Shrugged and Ayn Rand generally quite often. Her characters are too cardboard, but fundamentally, there's not enough conflict within the characters. And I think this really goes to the essence of both what Jordan Peterson and what Ayn Rand consider the struggle between good and evil. What they consider, in what they consider the fundamental way in which people achieve good, their whole view of life, and then I think their view of literature and what an internal struggle looks like. Now, for reference here, let's remember the goal of Ayn Rand's writing. What is Ayn Rand writing in order to do? Her goal of her writing, she says, is the portrayal of the ideal man. So, first one has to take that into consideration. She is trying to portray the ideal, trying to portray the perfect, the moral, the good. And you've got characters in her books, in Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, who really don't change throughout the novel, who are, in a sense, perfect, who are the ideal man, and that they are, one is more, has achieved the ideal fully, obviously John Galt, and another is on the path there, but changes relatively little. What changes really is this understanding of the world more than anything else. John Galt, in the novel, already gets the world. He understands it. He has a philosophical solution. He understands the philosophy killing the world. He understands it. Rourke in The Fountainhead needs to learn that, but as a character, in terms of his character traits, in terms of his moral character, he has already achieved the ideal man, the status of an ideal man. So those characters in the novels, it is true, I don't think this should be a criticism, but it is true that those characters do not have a struggle. They're not struggling. But what is interesting is that there are characters in Ayn Rand's novels that are struggling. They're struggling between good and evil. Their struggle is whether they will attain this ideal man status, whether they will strive towards being ideal or not, or give in to evil. And we'll talk about what evil is for Ayn Rand. Or give in to evil and never be the ideal. Characters like Reardon in Atlas Shrugged, to some extent Dominique, but I think it's more obvious in Reardon. To some extent Dagny, but it's more obvious Reardon. Dominique in The Fountainhead. Wynand in The Fountainhead. Stadler in Atlas Shrugged. These are all characters that have the ideal, the potential to be ideal, the potential to be moral, good, perfect human beings, but they are struggling. Reardon and Dominique ultimately resolve that struggle by embracing morality fully. Wynand and Stadler fail in that struggle, and ultimately, particularly Stadler, embrace evil fully. Wynand, in a sense, gives up on trying to achieve the moral. So you've got these struggles within significant characters. John Galt doesn't appear much in Atlas Shrugged. Atlas Shrugged is really a novel about Dagny and to some extent Reardon. Reardon appears in the novel far more than John Galt does. But you've got a struggle within Reardon. But what is Reardon's struggle? What is the struggle of good versus evil, if you will, within Reardon. For Rand, what is the essence of evil? The essence of evil is evasion, evading the facts. Reardon is not so much tempted by evasion. Reardon is confused. He is mistaken. He's got false premises. And he's trying to figure it out. He's trying to figure out what's true. The conflict within Reardon, and ultimately within Dominique, the conflict between Reardon and Dominique is, it appears that reality does not conform with some of my beliefs. Am I going to go with my beliefs, or am I going to stick with reality, stick with logic, stick with reason? And it takes them a while to figure it out. First, to see that that reality is not conforming with their beliefs, whether it's Reardon's relationship with his wife, Reardon's relationship with other people, the people that leech off of him, Reardon's relationship with sex, which is a huge part of his inner conflict, right? He's mistaken about his attitude towards sex. And he has to learn that it's wrong. And then, once he identifies that it's wrong, he has to embrace and acknowledge and integrate a new perspective on sex and on morality and on his own life and on other people. And that is the nature of the struggle within Reardon. And the same at the end, the same essentially is with Dominique. She has a wrong view of the world, the wrong view of the importance of other people, the wrong view of the power of other people over your own life. And she has to learn. And she struggles, just as Reardon struggles throughout the novel. I mean, one of the most powerful moments in Atlas Shrugged, scenes in Atlas Shrugged, is after Reardon and Dagny have sex for the first time. Reardon's explosion of a little speech about what they just did and the nature of what they just did, and the conflict within him about what they just did. And it's a psychological conflict. But it's a conflict that fundamentally is a consequence of an error of knowledge. Now, Winand and Stadler have basically the same kind of conflicts. The conflict between reality and between the facts, between logic, between reason, and between their ideas, their desires, their emotions. And they give up on reason. They give up on reality. And Stadler in particular spends the novel rationalizing for his immoral behavior, trying to justify it, trying to justify his immoral behavior. The standard is gold. And what you see is some people being able to resolve the inner conflict that they have in order to achieve gold-like status, and others give up on that conflict, resort and succumb to evil. And evil, again, for Ayn Rand, is evasion. And Stadler, that's exactly what he's doing. His rationalizations are all a cover-up of his evasion. Right? So, for Rand, there is inner conflict. But the inner conflict is a conflict between reality and mistaken beliefs that the heroes hold. And some of the heroes, or the good heroes, overcome, and the bad ones do not. They succumb to the bad beliefs. They reject reason. They reject reality. Now, for Jordan Peterson, good and evil don't have the same status as they do with Ayn Rand. In a sense, evil for Rand is the absence of reality, the absence of reason, the absence of facing the facts as they are. Evil, fundamentally for Ayn Rand, is evasion, evading reality, evading the truth, evading the facts. Evil for Ayn Rand is not an active force in reality. It's not something that's struggling with the good. It's not like the angel and the devil battling it out. But for Jordan Peterson, that's exactly what it is. Evil represents. Evil represents, and not just Jordan. I mean, this is true in Christianity. This is true in much of mythology of the past. It's true in ancient, in all kinds of ancient religions. But there is a role for the devil. The devil is an active participant in reality. He is there to drive you towards evil, towards doing evil things. And that devil, psychologically, according to Peterson, is in every single one of us. I mean, he talks a lot, if you listen to his lectures, he talks a lot about the fact that all of us are potential Nazis. All of us. If put in the right circumstances, would commit the most horrific acts. All of us must constantly suppress, must constantly overcome this tendency to be murderous, rape, pillage, murder, lying, cheating, stealing. They're all in us. They're all waiting to come out. And we must actively hold them back. And the struggle of good and evil is not a struggle for self-improvement and a struggle for reason and a struggle to identify what's true and what's not. It is literally a struggle not to commit murder. It's a struggle not to be a monster. The monster is looking within every one of us. Think about Dostoevsky. And this is what Jordan Peterson would consider great literature. And I agree with him. It is great literature. But it is a very, very, very different, it's a very different view, psychological view of man. It's a very, very, very different view of the struggle within our soul. Again, it is this struggle between a devil and an angel fighting within us, rather than our attempt to, in a sense, correspond or find the truth in reality and adhere to that truth. Adhere to that truth. So yes, Reardon never considers rape, pillage, and murder. Ayn Rand could never conceive of a man like Reardon doing that. Psychologically, it doesn't make any sense for Reardon to have a little devil on his shoulder wanting to do horrible things. But that, I think, to Jordan, is superficial. And partially this comes from where Jordan Peterson is, right? Jordan Peterson is a clinical psychologist. And I think many of his clients are really struggle with really horrible circumstances and horrible, wants, if you will, desires, passions. And they have, just like, Freud told us, I mean, we all want to sleep with our mothers, we all want to rape, pillage, murder, and we have to suppress that. And yeah, many of the people, the disturbed people that I think Peterson sees, and to some extent, from introspection, he sees it in himself, have those desires. But that's not the world. That's certainly not the world of healthy human beings. I don't think most of you have those urges that you need to suppress constantly. I don't think most of us, I guess I can only speak to myself, I don't see myself ever committing the atrocities that Jordan Peterson talks about or being tempted by them. So the kind of struggle between good and evil that Peterson imagines, I think partially because of his experience as a psychologist, partially because of his sense of life, which is very, very dark, partially because of his metaphysical belief, in a sense, that there is an evil force in the universe. And indeed, Peterson believes, counter to Ayn Rand, that the essential thing out there is suffering. The essential characteristic, the essential nature of human life is suffering. It is, and therefore, the essential activity is to overcome suffering. Because, and indeed, he says happiness is just something that happens to you, and happiness is what? Happiness is accidental. It doesn't happen because you pursue a particular course in life. And life generally is suffering. Right? So his whole view of the world, his whole view of life, his whole view of morality, his whole view of moral conflict is completely and utterly different than Ayn Rand's. And to require that great literature be like his expectation, that great literature can only reflect his particular view of moral conflict, is wrong and bizarre, and doesn't make it, and I think in this case atrociously wrong, because Ayn Rand, I think, is great literature, and her characters do struggle, and the struggle is fascinating and interesting, particularly if you read it a second or third time, particularly characters like Reardon and Dominique, the good characters. But even the struggle that Wynand and the struggle that Stadler go through, even the struggle of Stadler is not quite as elaborated on as Wynand's is, but the Wynand struggle within the Fountainhead are truly fascinating, are truly interesting. But you're not going to see it if you see good and evil as these malevolent forces, or evil as a malevolent force in the universe that one has to constantly overcome and constantly fight against. So Jordan, unfortunately, is missing out on much of what is interesting about Ayn Rand, and I think the fact that he doesn't get the philosophy, the fact that he is objecting to the philosophy, and that psychologically he is rejecting Ayn Rand's whole thesis of, moral perfection, of the ability to achieve happiness through one's own actions and through morality, makes it impossible for him to understand Atlas Shrugged and to understand what Ayn Rand is doing with the characters in Atlas Shrugged. All right, if there are any questions, about this, that would be great. I am looking. I'm looking through the questions we have, and I don't see any. So, all right. Hopefully, that's an answer. To me, Ayn Rand is the pinnacle of great literature, and again, the struggles of her characters are fascinating, particularly Reardon, who I find a really, really interesting and heroic and fascinating character. All right, let's see. So let's take a few more. Let's take a few more questions. Let me. Oh my God, there's some big questions here. This is going to be impossible. Okay, somebody asked, what are your thoughts on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? I'm just going to refer you to my work on this. If you search Yaron Brook, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there are lectures, and there are plenty of lectures, and there's actually a whole course that I did that's on YouTube for free on the history of the Middle East, on the history of the Middle East that relates to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also that a number of lectures specifically on that conflict. My opinion on that conflict has not changed since I gave those lectures, so I encourage you to go and listen to those lectures. I also encourage everybody to read Ilan Journo's latest book on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which I have here. I can't find it. I can't find it, but I have somewhere here. So I encourage you to look, because I endorse that book completely. So I don't want to spend the whole show now talking about that. It's a complex issue, and one that I've devoted a lot of time to. I've done whole shows on it. So just put in YouTube, put Yaron Brook Israel, and you'll find everything you need in terms of my views on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. All right. Do you think protests in Hong Kong have any hope of achieving democracy? Unfortunately not. I don't think they do. I think that it's much more likely that the Chinese will come in and suppress them, and that they will not achieve a vote. The Chinese can't afford to allow them to achieve a vote, because imagine if they let them do that, then they would be, they would be back to square one in terms of Tiananmen Square, and in terms of demonstrations and demonstrations and potentially a revolution within China to demand the vote. So no, I don't think there's any chance that China is going to allow for actual democracy in Hong Kong. It's just not going to happen. How this all gets resolved, I don't know. I fear it's going to be through Tiananmen Square 2.0. I don't see, they don't fear the response of the United States. I mean, at the end of the day, the United States response after Tiananmen Square was not very severe. And with Trump, I think the response would be far, far less severe if they went in Hong Kong and did something. I don't see the Brits doing anything. So, I mean, there's very few bad consequences. Very few bad consequences to, the Chinese, unfortunately, going in and crushing these demonstrations, which is unbelievably sad. One would hope that these demonstrations would spread to China, that you would get a popular uprising in China, and we would get China moving towards greater freedom as a consequence of that. But it's going to be very, very difficult. It's going to be very, very difficult to do. And there's no evidence to suggest that that's going to actually happen. All the evidence suggests the opposite. I think on minor issues, the Chinese will relent because they don't want the conflict, just in case. And so it's tragic, it's sad, it's upsetting, but the fact is that they're not going to get. So, the extradition law, the Chinese were willing to say, okay, we'll put it aside, but they're not going to be willing to put aside, they're not going to be willing to give in to the demand for elections, because once they do that, all hell will break out in China itself, and they are scared. They're very, very scared of the Chinese people. They're very, very scared of a revolution. They're very, very scared of another Tiananmen Square in China, because they're not sure how the military would go. I think they know how the military would act in suppressing something in Hong Kong, but do they know how they'd act in suppressing something in China? And of course, Taiwan is looking at this cautiously, because if the United States won't do anything, and I'm not talking about militarily, but anything, even morally, to defend the Hong Kong, what chance is there that the United States would abide by its defense treaty with Taiwan? So I think that what happens now is going to determine a lot of, in a sense, of the future of what happens between, of how aggressive China is going to be. And the weaker the American response is, and so far it's been pathetically, unbelievably weak, then the more likely it is that China gets more and more and more and more aggressive. The only way China would fold is if they thought that they would be penalized so harshly by the international community, primarily by the United States, that that it just wouldn't be worth it. But that's not going to happen. So they're going to have at it with Hong Kong, unfortunately. And it's a moral travesty. What the Trump administration is doing is a moral travesty. At least talk the talk. At least talk about the virtues of those protesting, the virtues of liberty and freedom, and support them morally, even if you're not going to obviously go to war or commit to supporting them in any other way. At least morally you can support them. It's kind of a minimum. All right, let's see. Can you explain bonds? Oh my God. So, finance question. I highly recommend my talk on a moral defense of finance. That there's a whole course. I think it's seven episodes also on YouTube. It's something called the moral defense of finance and financial markets, or something like that. In defense of financial markets, I think it is. And I talk a little bit about bonds there, but if you're interested in finance generally, that's the place to go. I cover a lot of stuff, including how the stock market works, why stock markets are productive, interest, bonds, and so on. So I cover a lot of stuff there. Quickly, what a bond is an IOU. All a bond is an IOU. I lend you money, and you give me a little piece of paper that says you're going to pay me the money back in 5 years with X amount of interest, and you're going to make payments over time that are at X interest rate, right? So, or an X dollar amount. That's all a bond is. It's just a piece of paper, a legal contract that is a contract between a borrower and a lender that basically describes the conditions under which let's say you're lending me money, under which I'm borrowing money from you, kind of what are those conditions and how I'm going to repay the money back to you. That's all a bond is. And a government bond is an IOU that the government has issued. A corporate bond is a IOU that a corporation has issued. And these IOUs are usually massive, so let's say it's $100 million, and they're usually broken into little bits. Let's say each bond is $10,000, and you can buy a bond, which is basically you're buying a government, if it's a government bond, you're buying a government IOU for $10,000. And when the bond expires, they give you $10,000, and in the meantime, they're paying you interest. And there are all kinds of bonds. They're municipal bonds that are then treated differently from a tax perspective, and then they're what's called high-yield bonds. These are bonds of very risky corporations, so the probability that they'll actually pay you back the money is lower than the government, where the probability there is considered to be 100%. And therefore, the interest that you expect to get on these bonds has to be higher, because you might not get the principal at the end. So, but think of them all as IOUs, and basically IOUs with varying risk characteristics and varying contractual obligations. If you have a follow-up question, follow up. But again, I recommend my course on financial markets. You can find that on YouTube or on my podcasting app. On any of the podcasting app, you can find my course on financial markets. All right, this is a question. Is it laughable to call out China for currency manipulation when Trump pressured the Fed to lower rates? Yes, it's laughable. But it's worse than laughable. It is complete economic ignorance. Complete and utter economic ignorance. I have said for over a year now that what will happen if you increase tariffs, and if the Chinese indeed start selling less to the United States, then what will happen was the value of the dollar will go up relative to the Chinese yuan. Or in other words, the value of the Chinese currency will go down relative to the dollar. And indeed, I've also said for more than a year and a half, for like 3-4 years, that the Chinese are holding their currency up. The Chinese are holding the currency up. They're actually, the market would devalue the currency more, would make their currency cheaper relative to the dollar. But the Chinese government for a long time didn't want that. Partially because they didn't want capital flight. They didn't want people leaving the country, moving their capital out of the country. So they wanted to keep their own currency value high. So the Chinese government has been working hard to keep their currency value up. But with the last round of tariffs, the pressure on the Chinese central bank was such that I don't think they could sustain a high value for the currency. The market, if you floated the currency, if the Chinese central bank basically stopped manipulating it, if you want to call it manipulating it, then I think the currency would drop quite a bit more than it dropped the other day at 2%. But what's lost here is that every government manipulates its currency. As soon as you have a central bank, you're a currency manipulator. As soon as you have a central bank, the central bank is manipulating the value of the currency by driving interest rates up or down, by printing more money, by printing less money, by buying assets in the market, by selling assets in the market. Everything the central bank does has an impact on the value of the currency. And indeed, as we're seeing, that's also true of things like taxes, like tariffs. By increasing tariffs, you're driving the value of the dollar up. And I've explained this on previous shows. What drives the trade deficit between the United States and China is Chinese desire to invest in the United States. To do that, they need dollars. To do that, they sell a lot of stuff to us and they don't buy a lot of stuff from us. Instead, they take all the excess dollars that they have and they invest in the United States. They buy our bonds, government bonds. They buy land, they buy businesses. The United States is the best place in the world still to invest. But you need dollars to invest. And to get dollars, you have to sell stuff to Americans. And that's what the Chinese do. Now, if they can't sell stuff to Americans, because Americans don't want to buy it because now it's taxed heavily, and therefore Americans reduce their consumption of Chinese stuff. Now the Chinese have fewer dollars from trade. Then what the Chinese can do is they go onto the open market and they buy dollars and sell their own currency, the yuan. When you sell your own currency, you devalue it. When you buy the dollar, you increase its value. And that's what's happening. Tariffs, by reducing American consumption of Chinese goods, will raise the value of the dollar relative to the value of the Chinese currency. And again, I've been saying it since we started the discussion about tariffs. And this, of all people, and this, I'm embarrassed to say this, but Paul Krugman actually had a pretty good op-ed in the New York Times, I think today or yesterday, where he said exactly this. I mean, Paul Krugman used to be an economist. Not a very good one, but at least he used to be an economist. He's not anymore, he's usually a hack. But his op-ed the other day criticizing the tariffs was very good because he gets the economics, he used to know it. When he did economics, he knew this economics, so he just has to bring that forward. Right? He just has to bring that forward, and he did. And he explained all of this in an op-ed, and you would think people in the White House would notice, and indeed, there are people in the White House who do know this. In the last round of tariffs, according to reports I've seen, I guess nobody knows for sure, every one of Trump's economic advisors, every single one of them, except the complete ignoramus, Peter Navarro, every single one of them tried to argue against raising tariffs, partially for the reasons I just articulated, that it doesn't achieve any of the goals Navarro and Trump hope they will, and all it will do is potentially lead this country into recession. By the way, the same argument was made by the Wall Street Journal editorial board, I think yesterday in the Wall Street Journal. This is not, what do you call it? This is not controversial economics. This is not Austrian economics. This is pretty mainstream. This is pretty straightforward economics. Tariffs don't make any sense. Any sense. Now, again, if you think, and maybe I'll try to talk about this. Well, let me see. There was another China question here. Let me see if there's another China question here. There was another China question in a different thread. Something about, do the Chinese have an accurate view of morality? Look, so let's just talk about China for a second. China is an evil regime. There's no question about that. China is authoritarian. It's not totalitarian, but it's authoritarian. Now, in my view, China is not an enemy of the United States. It does not constitute a clear and present danger to the individual rights of Americans. It is, though, a bad regime, an evil regime. A regime that treats its people really, really badly. Much worse than regimes in the West, America and Europe, as bad as our government is, as bad as the European governments are. China's is worse. No question about that. So my view is, and I've again said this many times, my view is, unless another country is an enemy, a risk, a clear and present danger, then the U.S. government has no business telling us what, how, when, with whom to trade. When Ayn Rand criticized trade with the Soviet Union, when Ayn Rand argued for complete embargo of the Soviet Union, now notice Ayn Rand never, ever, ever argued for tariffs on the Soviet Union, but an embargo on the Soviet Union. That was because the Soviet regime was a clear and present danger to the United States, or she viewed it that way. She believed there was an enemy striving to defeat the U.S., an enemy driven by an ideology that was meant to bring about the defeat of America, and that it was threatening all over the world and in America itself the rights and property of American citizens. And therefore, a regime like that should be embargoed. But even during Mao's time, Ayn Rand did not view China as a present danger to the United States. While she did not support Richard Nixon's trip to China, she did support an opening up to China, particularly given that she viewed it as a counter to the Soviet threat. Soviet Union was a threat, an existential threat to the United States. She did not view China as such. Yes, it was an evil regime, an evil ideology, but not one she believed needed to be embargoed. Ayn Rand was against the embargo of Japan before Pearl Harbor. Because yes, while Japanese were an evil regime, doing evil things all over Asia, an authoritarian, arguably totalitarian state, she did not advocate for an embargo of the Japanese under those circumstances. So the embargo should be a tool used only with one's enemies, one's explicit enemies, not a tool used to penalize and discipline bad regimes into becoming good. Now somebody says when China becomes a clear and present danger to America, it will be too late to do anything about it. Not true. Absolutely not true. I mean, first of all, one has to understand the goals of China, and if China has ambitions like the Soviet Union to bring about a proletarian global worldwide revolution, and I don't think China does. China's geopolitical ambitions are to become rich, to allow its population to become rich. They don't know exactly how, because if they did, and they don't want to do what is ultimately necessary to do that, which is to completely free their economy. Their ambitions is to be, the dominant player in Asia, and they are, whether we like it or not. But their goal is not to invade the United States. Their goal is not to take over America. Their goal is not to bring about a proletarian Marxist revolution around the world. There is no evidence to that. There's no evidence to China's global ambitions in terms of revolution. Yes, they want to have lots of influence in Africa because Africa has minerals and they want to trade with them. Yes, they want to have influence in Asia where they are the dominant player. Yes, they want to control the sea lanes into the South China Sea because it's called the South China Sea for a reason. It's China. But it is ridiculous, in my view, to say we will not trade, we should embargo China completely because it is an economic, quote, threat to us. It's not. Now, let me also say this, and this is something Ahmed also argued. If China continues in its authoritarian ways, it will not become as rich as they want and as rich as they need to become. If China continues with its authoritarian ways, they will not be able to develop the technology and the wealth to challenge the United States. The only way China can be a real threat to the U.S., assuming the U.S. stays free, is to become free. And if China's free, then it's not a threat to the United States. And of course, the United States, if we want to stay militarily a world superpower, the only world superpower, then we must be free. And the more authoritarian we become, the more central planning we embrace, the more taxes we embrace, the more of the left's economic policies we embrace, and I say left economic policies that are being embraced by the right, by Republicans, the more we will become weak. Now China's not using us. China's trading with us. Trade is not using. Trade is to mutual benefit. I would argue that we've been using China for decades now to raise our standard of living dramatically. I think to the extent that poor and middle class Americans have a much higher standard of living today than they did 30 years ago, in spite of all the bogus statistics you hear, it's because of trade with China. The United States has benefited massively from trade with China. And, that is obvious from the sheer volume of trade. Again, trade is win-win. Trade is not one-sided. Trade is not zero-sum. And if we have massive trade with China, it means we're winning. It means we're winning. And that's what people don't understand about trade, which drives me nuts. All right, so China's an evil regime. And whether we should trade with China or not should be up to you. You, as an individual, should decide whether you want to trade with the Chinese or not. I believe we should be trading with Cuba. I believe we should have complete open trade with Cuba today. I wouldn't buy anything from Cuba, but we should have open trade with Cuba because Cuba today is not a threat to the United States. I think there are only two countries that constitute a threat to the United States in the world today. Those are Iran and North Korea, and we should have an embargo on both of those, and luckily we do. All right. Well, we're getting a lot of super chat questions. This is great. All right. Thoughts on Stephen Pinker's view of objectivism? I don't really know of his thoughts on objectivism, so I'm going to pass on that. I understand he's in communication with some objectivists, so I'll research his views I'll research his views on objectivism and get back to you. All right, there's one more China question, and I'm doing these out of order. Is China's system similar to National Socialism in Germany? No, for a variety of reasons. One is China's system is not based on some kind of philosophical, racial identification of superiority and the seeking of world domination. It just isn't in what China is trying to do. And China, by the way, is way too poor to even consider that. Also, I think there's a lot more freedom in China than there was in Nazi Germany. I mean, a lot more. I mean, you can't get the kind of success that China has seen economically over the last, 40 years without a significant amount of freedom. Now, I think that freedom is shrinking right now under the current regime. I think the current regime is really, really nasty. But there are no restrictions on leaving China. I mean, I travel all over the world, and all over the world, what you see, Chinese tourists everywhere. That's not a characteristic of a fascist, totalitarian regime like the Nazis or the communists. What you see is real wealth creation. Not just printing of money, but real wealth creation in China. Now that is a characteristic of freedom, not of totalitarian regimes. There was no wealth creation in the Soviet Union. There was no wealth creation in Mao's China. There was maybe a little successful project here and a little successful project there, but there was no wealth creation, certainly not anywhere close to the scale we're seeing in China. There is a lot of freedom when it comes to business. In Nazi Germany, business was all ultimately run by the government. There was the pretense again of private property, but everything was regulated, controlled, and run by government. That is true in some sectors in China, but certainly not true throughout China. There are plenty of large businesses that are not dominated by government control. And there's a freedom of expression that exists in China that didn't exist in Nazi Germany. Not for very long. And it has existed for 40 years in China. It was ups and downs, and has systematically increased, although again, recently has been in decline. There have been real opposition figures, particularly intellectual opposition, economic opposition, translation of books that are clearly opposed to what the regime is doing, including my books, both my books, Ayn Rand's books, all of Ayn Rand's books. And they sell fairly well. They're not bestsellers, and maybe if they were bestsellers, they would get into trouble. But in many respects, China is less regulated from a business perspective than certain sectors in America. So no, National Socialism in Germany and communism in China and in Russia, the Soviet Union, were totalitarian regimes. China is not a totalitarian regime. Now, it might be moving towards in that direction because of this social score and massive surveillance of its people. But it hasn't got there, and it hasn't been that for the last 40 years. And my argument is, if it gets there, if it becomes totalitarian, then it will also become poor. It will lose its success. It won't be able to produce the wealth. Wealth production is a consequence of freedom. It doesn't happen without it. So, China's system it's a weird system. It's the areas that are left basically free, the areas intellectually that are left free, the areas that are heavily controlled, there's no voting, and the areas that are left free are the areas that flourish and the areas that succeed. And you can see that geographically in China, and you can see that by industry in China. And, again, the regime does horrible things, primarily with prisoners and primarily with minorities, primarily if they're Muslim. They're doing horrible, horrible things. And it's not like you have complete freedom of expression in China. You don't. But you have much more than you did under Nazis. And you have much more than you did under Mao or under... So it's degrees, unfortunately. Right? And, so they and again, they regulate parts of their business world less than we do. China's nowhere near as socialist as the Nazis were. Nowhere near as socialist as the Nazis were. I mean, think about also, the wealth, how much wealth was created during the Nazi period. I mean, all of the industrialization that happened under the Nazis, almost all of it basically went into weapons. Now, China's building up a military, but it's also building up peaceful manufacturing for trade purposes. So I don't think there's any similarities between China and the Nazis. I don't think there's any similarities between China and the Soviet Union. I don't think there's any similarities between China today and Mao's China. While China is an evil regime, while China's regime is bad, it's nowhere near as bad as North Korea. It's nowhere near as bad as Iran. And it is not, in my view, an enemy a military enemy of the United States. And there is no other type of enemy. There's only a military enemy of the United States. Yeah. Now, is the Chinese government involved in business? Sure it is. So is ours, right? I mean, let's be honest. Ours is very involved in business. Look at all the farm subsidies we're giving our farmers. Look at all the subsidies we really give Boeing through military contracts. I mean, unfortunately, the question is here an issue of degree. As our government has grown and intervenes more and controls more and subsidizes more and gives out favors more, in certain realms, the Chinese government leaves business alone. Now, again, I'm not saying you should necessarily sell sophisticated military technology to the Chinese. Obviously, you shouldn't. You shouldn't sell it to anybody. I mean, the funny thing is we're selling it to the Saudis. We're selling it to the Turks, who are then allied with the Russians, who are also aligned with the Iranians. So I think the whole issue of military technology is a complicated one, and one has to really think through what is the relationship between a government, military contractors, and then the ability of those military contractors to sell that military technology outside of the United States. I think that's complicated. And certainly I think there should be restrictions on that, and severe restrictions on that. But we don't have anywhere near a coherent policy and a coherent foreign policy that would guide those kind of sales. And again, I find it fascinating that suddenly everybody, left, right, and center, is terrified of the Chinese. Right? Trump has this amazing ability to define the topics that we all, to define the topics that we all obsess about, and to define the way we talk about those topics. So he puts me in a position to be defending China when I don't want to defend China, because I think China as a regime is horrible, and what they're about to do in Hong Kong is atrocious, and I think the Trump administration should condemn them, but stop the stupid tariffs. Stop the whole issue of currency manipulation and talking nonsense, economic ignorant talk. Let's focus on the things where we should be criticizing China, and let's focus on the things where we should be defending our interests, and let's focus on the things where we should establish ourselves as the dominant military power in the world. There are ways to do that without turning China into an enemy, a military enemy. All right. I mean, and I encourage anybody, by the way, I really encourage everybody to go to China sometime. I mean, it's hard to talk about China unless you've been there. I mean, I was always very skeptical of China, very negative about China, very doubtful. It was all a mirage. It wasn't really real. It didn't really happen. They're really communists, but they're not communists in China. In my view, there are very few real communists in China. There are more Marxists in American universities than there are in Chinese universities. More Marxists in American universities than there are Chinese universities. The philosophy driving the Communist Party in China is not communism. It's how to maintain power. It's pragmatism from the perspective of power, not from the perspective of some proletarian ideology of Marx, of communism. Again, I'm not defending communism because China's not communist. And it again astounds me. Do some research, read up on China. Don't just listen to the pundits. Don't listen to Fox News or CNN, any of these guys. Read up, read some history, and go visit. And yeah, they have to put on this facade of communism because they get their moral kind of legitimacy from Mao Zedong and the Great Revolution and all this BS. But they're not communists. They don't believe in communism. They don't advocate for communism. My book, Equal is Unfair, is published in Chinese, approved by the government. A communist government would never approve a book called Equal is Unfair. The whole point of communism, the essence of communism is equality. And I'm saying equality is immoral. I've got a whole book on the fact that equality is immoral. A communist government doesn't allow for the distribution and sale of a book called Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, or Atlas Shrugged. But actually, the Chinese government kind of doesn't have a problem with inequality. And actually, I mean, my guess is they don't mind me defending inequality. Now, they don't like the particular way I defend inequality, but they don't mind me defending inequality because they have inequality and they want to maintain inequality. But they are not communists. And until you get that China is not communist anymore, it's much closer to fascism than it is to socialism. It's much closer to that. China is an authoritarian regime run by a bunch of pragmatists who want power, who want control, and that's all what they want. And we now are unbelievably fearful of China and interpret everything in China as somehow some kind of communist takeover. But it's not. You need evidence to that. Go talk to Chinese professors at Chinese universities, or so talk to even Chinese dissidents. Here in China, the people I interact with are Chinese dissidents in China, people who've sat in jail for opposing the regime. Right? I speak in China, I've spoken in China many, many times. And I speak to groups that are free market groups, people who are fighting the government, who are known to be fighting the government. They say they are communists, but they are not. They say they're communists because they need a connector to Mao and the revolution, which the people are convinced are what brought China to greatness. But again, their policies are not communist. Their policies are not. There's no Medicare for all in China. There's no Medicare for all. Do you know that much of Chinese healthcare is private healthcare? And if you don't have the money to pay, you die. Do you know what communism is? Just because somebody puts a label of communism on themselves doesn't mean they're a communist. So, I would never defend a communist country, but they're not communist. Neither is Vietnam today. They're run by communist parties that have given up on communism and today have adopted significant amounts of free market. And power lust is what they want. All right, Sanders was on Joe Rogan podcast. Did you see it? No, I haven't seen it. I might do a review of it. Review of these. Okay, somebody's asking, the poster behind me, not the Vermeer, but the other one, who is the artist? It's Brian Lawson. Brian Lawson. All right. So when I see the Sanders interview, I'll comment on the Sanders interview. Thoughts on the show Justified. I love the show Justified. It was a lot of fun. It was one of those fun shows I've seen in the last 10 years, I guess. I recommend watching it. I can't remember how many seasons there are, 5 or 6. I mean, it drags a little bit towards the later seasons. Certainly the first couple of seasons are excellent. The opening of this first season is a classic. It's a great opening. Basically, Justified is a Western. It's a modernized Western. It's good versus evil. The cowboy, the sheriff in town, the sheriff taking the law into his own hands, fighting evil, fighting the bad guys. You have what do you call it? Gunfights in the streets. I mean, it is fantastic. Justified. I think it's on Netflix, on Hulu, on Prime. It's certainly on one of those. I've seen it. I saw it when it was on TV a few years ago, and I love the actor who plays the hero. It's heroic. I mean, it undercuts the hero a little bit. I mean, they always have to. You have to have, the hero has to have a bad marriage and has to have personal problems. I mean, that's just pathetic. But in his pursuit of justice, it's just terrific. It's just terrific. And it's got humor and it doesn't shy away from heroism, which is good. And the bad guy, I forget the name of the bad guy, but the bad guy is a really well acted and really good. I'm just going to comment on this. That's to be the last comment from this guy. He says Fidel Castro would be the first to tell you his goal was freedom. I'm not talking about what their goal is. I'm talking about what they are doing. Stop talking about what they actually said, but what they do. And yes, everybody uses the word freedom. I use the word freedom as the absence of coercion, the creation of a socio-economic system in which people are free to pursue their own happiness. That's freedom. Free of coercion, to pursue their own happiness. People have relatively high degrees of freedom in China. No, not as free as they are in the United States, but nowhere near as oppressed as they are in Cuba, nowhere near as oppressed as they are in North Korea, nowhere near as oppressed as they were in the Soviet Union, and nowhere near as oppressed as they were in Mao's China. I'm not talking about what they say. I'm talking about what they do. I'm talking about the reality on the ground. And again, do your research, not just from the websites that condemn China. Try to find objective sources about what's really going on in China. And ideally, go visit. Because until I went to visit, I didn't believe it. But when you go to the streets, when you go to Shanghai, and the billboards are larger than Times Square, the billboards, advertising stuff. In communism, there is no advertising. In communism, there are no shopping malls. The shopping malls here are huge, bigger than the ones in the US, flashier. Communism, you don't have stores of Louis Vuitton on the main street of your cities. But there's Louis Vuitton in Shanghai and in Beijing. I mean, it drives me crazy when people argue from a state of ignorance, literal ignorance. How do you reconcile communism with shopping malls, communism with massive billboards, communism with 10-lane highways where people have massive cars, communism with Starbucks and KFC. KFC's everywhere. They love KFC. KFC and Starbucks don't go with communism. I don't know what you call the Chinese system other than power-lusting authoritarianism. But communism, it is not. You can't, there has never been a communist country with skyscrapers, modern skyscrapers, individualistic skyscrapers that express individual values, that put even New York to shame. And a population, I mean, here's the difference. When Mao ran China, and people went there, I wasn't there, but people always described this to me. Everybody wore the same clothes, and everybody looked down, they never looked you in the eye, and they shuffled. They wore gray working clothes, and they shuffled. When you go to China today, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Dongguan, all places I've been to, and I've also been to rural China, little villages where they're poor. So firsthand evidence matters. Particularly in the cities, what you see is people dressed in all kinds of clothes, individualistic clothes, clothes that express themselves. They're loud, they're boisterous, they're happy, they're yelling, they're engaged, they're passionate, they look you in the eye, they're intrigued by foreigners, and then they travel all over the world, they're tourists all over the world, they go see how the rest of the world lives. Communist regimes don't allow that because they don't want their people to see how other people live. So I'm open to the argument that China is such an evil regime we shouldn't trade with it as individuals. I'm open to that. I'm even open that it's a military threat. You can make that argument. But it ain't communist. It ain't communist. So stop using that because it makes you look ridiculous because it's completely disconnected. It means you don't know what communism is, and it's completely disconnected from the reality. They want to be rich. They all want to be rich. And they think being rich is good. including the poor people in the villages who are still dirt poor. They want the opportunity to be rich. They're eager for the opportunity to be rich. And the biggest worry that the central government has is that their economy tanks, and the people who thought they were going to be rich are not rich anymore, and they will rise up and have a revolution. All right, I'm going to go back to Super Chat questions. Enough China. All right, since great art portrays life as it should or could be, is there... Well, no, that's not the definition of great art. Romantic art portrays life as it should or could be. Great art can describe life as it is. There is great art that is naturalistic. Tolstoy is great art, but naturalistic. There's all kinds of great art that has nothing to do with life as it should or could be. That is the definition of romantic art. Great romantic art, right? Is there not a danger that one might prefer fiction to reality? I don't see why. The purpose of art is not, in the end you live in reality. Now, there's a sense in which you can prefer the world of the fiction because the world in which you live is nowhere near as good. And that's great, because that should fuel your desire to make the world in which you live better. So, by portraying characters as they should and could be, it should give you the motivation, the insight and the motivation to strive to be one of those characters. Not to escape reality, but to embrace reality, because that's the only way you can be one of those characters. And the same with the world. To see a world as it should and could be, and you live in a world that is not, gives and should give you the motivation to make the world, at least your world, that kind of world. Not to dive into the video games or to dive into just reading all day and not doing anything. No, it's the opposite. It gives you fuel to live in this world, to live in this reality. Have you seen the Jimmy Stewart movie Harvey? I think it promotes individualism. It's been a long time, so I think this was Jennifer who asked. I'm gonna let me get back to you after I see it again. I haven't seen it in a long time, so I don't want to comment. That is the era of great movies that actually had individualistic characters in them. So wouldn't be surprised if part of its theme was individualism. Can an objectivist be spontaneous? Do random acts of kindness, give a buck to a homeless, make fun mistakes in life, go out and have drinks? Or is it always stop and think, then act? No, certainly one can be spontaneous, but one has to be aware of the context within which one is being spontaneous. And one has to make sure that one is not doing oneself damage by being spontaneous. Now, I don't get drunk. I don't believe in getting drunk. I don't like being around people who are drunk. I don't like people who are unfocused. Being drunk makes me unfocused. I see the unfocus in other people. I don't think being drunk is fun, and I don't think being around drunk people is being fun. Go have a drink, get a little bit of a buzz, stay in control, great. But lose control? I don't see any value in that. So to me, going out and having drinks, that's great. Being spontaneous, sex is spontaneous. Not necessarily. What you do during sex hopefully is spontaneous. You don't stop and think, okay, now I'm going to switch to the missionary position because here's the logical argument why missionary right now is the appropriate position to have sex in. No, that would not make for good sex, right? And one does not act that way in life. Now, the more integrated you are in certain areas of life, the more spontaneous you can be, because the more, in a sense, you trust your subconscious. So in a sense, I'm talking to you now spontaneously. I'm not thinking about every sentence that comes out before I say it. I'm answering your questions without preparing notes, because I trust myself not to say complete nonsense. I'm not sure everything that I say here is 100% true because I haven't thought it through, but it's good enough that I am being spontaneous. I'm answering your questions spontaneously. Somebody says sex is overrated? No, sex generally is underrated, but okay. So of course we can be spontaneous. I'm being spontaneous right now. But you can be spontaneous in parties and among friends and relationships, but you always have to monitor that spontaneity. Make sure you're not doing anything that's damaging to you. Make sure you're not doing something that's really stupid, that is doing harm. And make sure that that you trust yourself. That is, have an integrated personality. So I go out and drink. I know I'm not going to drink too much. I haven't drunk too much in, I don't know, probably 40 years, right? Last time I got drunk. And I don't have to think about not getting drunk. I just don't get drunk. That's spontaneous for me, right? So as you integrate the ideas more and more, you get to trust yourself more and more, and you can be more and more spontaneous in more and more areas of your life. But when you have to make an important decision, when you have to do key things, when you have to really think through a real issue, a real problem, some new knowledge, some new information, you better stop and think about it. Somebody's asking what my favorite drink is. I mean, the only alcohol I really drink is red wine. I like red wine. Somebody says Yaron hates contemporary art. I mean, I would hate contemporary art if there was such a thing. But there's almost no contemporary art. The stuff that passes for contemporary art today mostly is not art at all. So I don't hate contemporary art because there's nothing to hate. Yeah, but you can't live, you don't live by stopping and thinking and stopping and thinking and stopping and thinking. You do the thinking so that you're integrated so that you can then act in reality, trusting. And this is the role of principles, right? This is part of why principles are so important, right, in morality. So you spend real time studying, for example, the virtue of honesty. And you figure out, and you think about it deeply, that honesty makes sense. That honesty is the right strategy for living a good life. That you just should be honest. Well, that's it. I mean, you don't need to do much thinking about honesty again. From there on, you've got now as a principle, I'm going to be honest, and you just act on it. And you don't have to rethink it every time. But you have to consciously integrate. And to me, one of the most important courses, there's Leonard Peikoff and his courses that are all on, by the way, this will be the last. Please stop the Super Chat questions because otherwise we're going to be here all night. I've got a whole backlog already. So Chris, I think that'll be the last one. You've got to spend time integrating your values. You've got to spend time integrating philosophical ideas. You've got to get integrating your knowledge. Integration is what allows you then to trust yourself and to be spontaneous. Right? But until you do that integration, you have to really, really monitor yourself very, very carefully. And integration is not easy because you've got a lot of crap in your subconscious. You've got a lot of crap you've absorbed from the culture, particularly if you're young today and you grew up with this nihilistic, leftist, hedonistic mentality that's so prevalent in America today. Right? Then you do not want to just trust your subconscious. You have to really extricate the garbage. And the only way to extricate the garbage is to integrate the good. It's to integrate the good. I mean, if you're young, under 25, I think, the attitude, because of pornography and because of the attitude towards sex out there, you probably have a very hedonistic view of sex. And you probably have a very casual view of sex. And you probably don't think there's any problem with that because, hey, sex is kind of enjoyable. It's kind of fun. But you're missing out. You're missing out on what sex makes possible if you take it seriously. If you don't just sleep around. Right? If you actually think of it as an important value, treat it as an important value, sex, and get the most out of it rather than the least out of it. But that's hard when, again, let's say the hedonism of the culture is so ingrained. And until you integrate a proper view of sex, you will have the culture's view of sex dominating. Right? Dominating. Okay. I know people who encourage others to embrace their suffering because they view it as a universal constant. What would you say to those who hold suffering as a virtue and puts importance on pain? I'd say, what would I say? I'd say stop it. I'd say that's evil. Suffering is the enemy of life. Suffering is the enemy of happiness. Suffering the enemy of living. Suffering is, we have a pain-pleasure mechanism. Pain is a warning sign. It's not something to be desired. It's not something to be sought after. It's a warning sign. This is bad for you. You are moving towards death and away from life. Suffering is a sign. It's reality telling you, in a sense. It's not literally telling you, right? But you're getting that what you're doing is bad for you. What you're doing is leading to death. If you value life, avoid suffering. If you value life, move away from it. And this idea of universal constant, why? Where? Who? Show it. If somebody's claiming that as a positive, then prove it. I know Jordan Peterson's kind of attempted to prove. Well, we all die. That's awful, the fact that we die. And therefore, and that hovers over our entire lives, the fact that we're going to die, that this is going to end, that it's tragedy. Our death is a tragedy. And therefore, our whole life is a tragedy. Well, but that's absurd. Death is. Just like the fact that you came into being just is. The fact that you die just is. It's an important data point because it conditions you. It is what should motivate you to live. The existence of death is a motivation to live. It's a motivation to avoid the things that will lead you to death. And death is the headline under which I put suffering and pain and everything else that's bad. So there is no reason to view suffering as universal. Now, I can understand to some extent Hobbes thinking life is short, brutish, and what was it? That Hobbes thinking that suffering is a universal constant because life back then was, to a large extent. But we live in the 21st century. Life's pretty cool. Where is this universal suffering that I'm supposed to engage in? Where is this horror that's happening in the world? It's happening to other people, but it's not happening to me. And if it's not happening to me, then it's not a universal constant. Maybe I'm just lucky. Certainly luck has something to do with this. The existence of death is not what motivates one to live. It's what motivates one to do the things necessary to live. One has to, the fundamental choice in life is between life and death. Once you choose life, then what you're doing is avoiding death or everything that death represents. The suffering, the pain, the agony, the irrational, the evasion, all of those are death. Morality is a guide to life, to living. to success. To success. Somebody wants a picture of my wife. Why would anybody want a picture of my wife? That's creepy. Adam, that's creepy. All right. So, I think one has to view death as the thing one's avoiding in living a good life. And now, as I've said before, there are times when death is the best option for living because life is so intolerable one chooses to live. But anyway, left to stay, Andrew Jackson was as bad as Hitler. What is your rebuttal? All right, somebody's asking for a quick follow-up. So, okay, this is the really last super chat, guys. You're going to keep me up all night. I know I can't resist you. All right, before we get to Andrew Jackson, we're going to do this. Some people equate struggle with suffering. Is this a package deal? And language error. It's definitely a package deal. I mean, and I'm not saying one can always avoid suffering. Suffering sometimes is unavoidable. I mean, you get sick, but it's you want to, it's not what you strive towards, and it's not what shapes your life. It's not how you define your life. Struggle just means something is hard, and one has to work hard at it. And it's not always pleasant. But that doesn't mean suffering. Hopefully, if you've chosen the right career and you've chosen the right struggles in life, you enjoy the struggle, the right values in life. You enjoy the struggle to get them. Like training for a marathon. Yeah, it's hard, and there's a struggle to do it. But it's also incredibly satisfying. The struggle itself is satisfying. And yes, there's physical pain, but even the physical pain can be spiritually satisfying because you know that the physical pain is a reflection of your effort, a reflection of your progress towards your goal. But the whole point is the goal. The whole point is the striving towards the goal. And the goal, if the goal is a good goal, the goal is a value, it's life promoting, it's happiness enhancing. You don't set up values and goals that are suffering enhancing. Even Jordan Peterson wouldn't do that. But many of them are struggles. And yes, there's a package deal of struggle and suffering. I mean, there are a lot of these kind of package deals. One of these shows this week we'll do there's something called now workism, this idea that we worship work too much. And we get too much of our spiritual values from work. So I want to talk about that one of these times. Okay, back to leftists. Andrew Jackson was just as bad as Hitler. What is your rebuttal? Now, I'm not an expert on Andrew Jackson. But from everything I know, he's nowhere near as bad as Hitler. He didn't attempt world domination. He didn't start a world war that killed millions and millions of people in an effort to, take over vast countries and engage in massive warfare. What is it that Andrew Jackson's accused of? I assume that what he's accused of is the slaughter of the American Indians and the supposed taking of their land. So there's a whole argument about land, and I'm not going to go into all of it here, but I don't consider that anywhere near the equivalent to going to war. I don't think the Indians had land. They didn't have an idea that the land was theirs. The land was just there, and they used it sometimes. To the extent that some Indians did have land, let's say there were some Indian communities that were farmers and they did have lands, to the extent that Andrew Jackson and others took that land from them, that was bad and wrong and evil and should be condemned. But not everything that somebody does, bad and evil, puts them in the same category as Hitler. Just like the current regime in China is nowhere near as evil as Stalin, Lenin, and Mao Zedong, right? They're evil, but they're not as evil as Hitler. Well, the same thing is true of Andrew Jackson. A lot of the things he did to the Indians were damn right shameful, evil, ignorant, horrible. The mass slaughter of Indians, to the extent that they infected some blankets with bacteria, and I don't know if that story's true, but if it's true, that's evil, that's wrong, that's horrible. Right? So there's no question that what the American government did, and still does in my view, to the American Indians is a travesty of justice, is wrong. But the idea that we invaded their land and took their land, that's just a complete and utter exaggeration. When you have when you have primitive cultures that are nomadic, they don't have a claim on all the land that they happen to travel through. And if they're civilized people who come in, claim that land, use that land, build civilization around that land, then property rights are defined by use. But, somebody says the American Indians are the oldest welfare recipients in the country. Yes, but they're not recipients because they want the welfare. They're recipients because the American government has forced them to accept welfare. And I did a whole show of this a few years ago. The great tragedy of the American Indians in modern times, certainly, is we treat them like children. We give them no individual rights. We give them no property rights. No property rights. The tribe owns all the land in the Indian reservations, and even the tribal council can't decide what to do with that land without approval from the central government, from the federal government, the Land and Indian whatever Bureau. I would take all those reservations, divide them up into parcels, give the parcels to the individual Indian families who live there, and let them do whatever they want with it. Get rid of the reservation system, get rid of all of that. So we have treated the American Indian horrifically throughout American history. There's no question about that. And so there is some argument to be made that Andrew Jackson and other presidents of the United States acted immorally and were really, really bad in the way they treated Indians. But that is not the same as concentration camps. That is not the same with engaging in a world war for world domination. There's a huge difference between those presidents and Hitler. And again, you have to be able to argue that, yes, in this one specific domain, just like slavery, in this one domain, the founders and the early American presidents were all very, very bad. But you know what? In other domains, they were world leaders in how good they were. And you can't separate, you can't condemn them like, there's no realm in which Hitler was good. Everything he touched was evil. Everything. So it's not in the same ballpark. It's not in the same category. Again, slavery is horrific. And the fact that America had slavery in its early years is horrific. But that doesn't put it in the same category as communist China or communist Soviet Union or Nazi Germany. Evil is not relative, but evil is a matter of degrees. Evil is clearly a matter of degrees. Not everybody's equally evil. Man, people take what I say and they twist my words. All right. What may trigger a national switch to objectivism? I don't think you could have a national switch to objectivism. I think you have to reach a tipping point, and there will be a tipping point at some point where the nation becomes objectivist or tips towards objectivism. What that requires is that objectivists become the dominant intellectual voices in the culture, that they dominate the intellectual high ground, that they're everywhere, that they're the most watched people on YouTube, that they're the most watched people on television, that they're the most read books and constantly on television, and they're known, obvious spokesman for the ideas, articulating the ideas, applying those ideas generally in the culture. There's no negative thing that happens in the culture that will bring objectivism about. Objectivism can only spring out of a positive. And that positive is intellectual activism. The only way objectivism will become culturally dominant is for objectivism to become the dominant secular philosophy, to be everywhere intellectually, to be the thing people say, oh, I wonder what the objectivists think of that. When that happens, when people start thinking about, okay, the conservatives say this and the left says that, well, what do the objectivists think about that? And many people, millions of people start thinking, asking that question. That's when you can expect a switch to happen. And to get there is going to require, it's going to require a lot of work, right? A long time. You're going to have lots of voices, lots of intellectuals, and they're going to have to become dominant. But that's it. It is one thing we need is more intellectuals and more intellectuals and more intellectuals and more intellectuals. Yeah, Louise says correctly. It's not just an issue of evils, degree of evils, but it's also an issue of context. One has to take into account context. One has to take into account the context in which actions are taken. Now, slavery is evil, post-Declaration of Independence. They know enough. It's evil. But to write everybody associated with slavery off in the same breath as Hitler is ridiculous and absurd. All right, I need to ignore the people who don't understand. So that's the switch to objectivism. Okay. Any thoughts about Colombia in 2016 peace agreements with the FARC? How do you deal with a terrorist group that claims they want to stop fighting? They have to surrender. They have to be prosecuted, and they have to be punished for what they did. The Colombian 2016 peace agreement is really, really, really bad for Colombia, and I fear that there will be devastating consequences to pay for it in the future. Right. All right. So I'm very much against it. Terrorists cannot be negotiated with. Terrorists cannot be appeased. And people who committed terrorism, just like people who committed murder, cannot be negotiated with. They have to suffer the consequence of their actions. They have to go to jail, and they have to repent. And going to jail is a form of repenting. And other than, if they're not willing to do that, then they need to be crushed militarily. All right, we did that. Okay, would you play Minecraft? No, I'm just not interested in playing computer games of any sort. Will Peikoff release a book? I assume Leonard Peikoff? I don't think Leonard's going to release any more books. I think Leonard's done, certainly philosophy books he's done. He's writing fiction, but I don't know that he's going to publish any books. I don't think he considers himself a professional fiction writer. He's doing it for fun. He does it because he loves it. I don't expect him to release any books. How wary should a young person be about the future in terms of government debt and general trajectory and consequence of economic policy in the United States? I would say you should be very wary. The economic trajectory of the United States is not positive. I mean, I think primarily because there are no advocates for capitalism. So when given the right has become so anti-capitalist, as manifest with Trump, I just don't see who can step in and fix it, even temporarily. Who can give us a reprieve from the disaster that is coming? So I'm worried. I used to think, okay, well, there'll be this pendulum. Yes, we keep shifting to the left and keep shifting to authoritarianism, but the shifts are small. We tend to, move towards a little bit of more freedom for a while. That gives us enough energy to keep going, and then we drift leftwards, and then we shift backwards. Every shift backwards, we're more left than we were before, but generally, this is the kind of Ronald Reagan effect. It brought the country back. It created economic growth. It got us motivated. It gave us the 1990s, and then Then since then, we've been shifting backwards towards the left. But now I'm not sure there's a Republican Party with the spirit to move us, to give us that pendulum consequence. So now it's left, 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 left. And spend, 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 spend. Take on debt, 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 debt. Engage in trade wars. I mean, left and right. Now the Democrats are embracing Trump's trade wars. So I would be very worried. I mean, I don't have, I mean, the only good news I would say, and I know people hate this when I say it, is the only thing driving the U.S. economy positively today, the only place in which there's positive economic news, in which we're seeing real economic growth, we're seeing a real impact on the quality and standard of living of Americans, where we're seeing, I think, a underappreciated percentage of the increase in standard of living in America comes from one industry in one place, and that is technology. It's what so many of you love to hate. It's big tech, but small tech, the entrepreneurs and big tech. It's basically Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is driving the U.S. economy, and the only thing that could save the U.S. economy is Silicon Valley. It's technology. It's massive new advancements in technology that just increase, whether it's increase our lifespan or increase our quality of life or increase our living standards dramatically, in spite of all the BS that's coming from Washington, D.C. Right? I think that's the only thing that can save us and give us more time and buy us more time. Think about the fact, where would we even get there? You know, where would there be any place where there's real progress other than in the field of technology, biotech, places like that? Silicon Valley, the place we love to hate because the people there tend to be on the left. So, you know, I'm big on the technology industry, and I think it's the only thing that can save this country from economic destruction. And I think it's undervalued and underappreciated, even in the economic numbers, the extent to which it contributes to real standard of living improvements in the United States. All right, but again, be wary, be worried, be scared. I don't see any alternative to that, unfortunately. It's difficult times we live in, and the economic ignorance and the economic trajectory is not good. It's not good. Yes, enjoy the fact that Trump cut your taxes and you have a little bit more money in the pocket. Enjoy that money for as long as you can, because when the Democrats win and they take that money from you, or when the economy collapses because of debt that the government just keeps accumulating more and more and more of, that extra money in your pocket won't matter one iota. One iota. All right, I hate to end on such a negative note. Somebody said I should do more shows on TV shows. I'll try. I mean, as I said, I'm a huge fan of Justified. I hope you all enjoy it, watch it. If you like Westerns, if you like that attitude of Westerns, then go do it. Thoughts on Bernie Sanders on Real Rogan Show? I haven't seen it. Somebody already asked that question. I haven't seen it. When I see it, I promise you will have my thoughts. Maybe I'll see it this weekend and do a show on it in the next couple of days, since there seems to be a lot of interest. I mean, me criticizing Bernie Sanders sounds boring because, I mean, it seems like it would be obvious, my criticisms of Bernie Sanders. I basically disagree with everything he says. So, but yeah, we'll do that. Oh my God, one more. Do you have any thoughts on how Armstrong's criticism of objectivism airwise convincingly addressed? It was wondering. Yeah, I don't have any more thoughts than what you've seen from people like Don Watkins wrote a critique of Ari's book, and you've seen some stuff from ARI. I think Ari just doesn't get Ayn Rand's ethics, and he misrepresents it, and he creates a straw man, and he's wrong. All right. I'll see you all tomorrow. So I'm going to do another show tomorrow, probably 3 p.m. East Coast time, maybe a little bit later, but I'm going to shoot for 3 p.m. East Coast time. So I hope to see you all here tomorrow and Sunday and Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday and Saturday. And that's it then for a long time. Please, if you don't do anything else, share the shows. And I know Christian is going to turn all these questions into short videos. Please share the short videos, because I know a lot of you are hesitant to share an hour, 45-minute show with your friends. But please share as much as you can. Those of you who do not yet support the show, if you're getting value out of this show, and I assume you are because you are listening, I encourage you to support the show, show your appreciation. Many of you do so through the Super Chat. I appreciate that. Another way to do it is through the YaronBrookShow.com/support. You can set up a PayPal where you can, I have people there who give me $2 a month, and I appreciate that. And then I have people who give me $500 a month, and I appreciate that. And so I appreciate anything you can do. There's NFL tomorrow. Well, I don't watch the NFL that much. But tomorrow's Saturday. Maybe, I guess there's some games tomorrow. And I guess the season hasn't started. This is just preseason, right? I don't watch the preseason. You shouldn't watch the preseason. Wait until the actual season starts. And so please support the show. You can also do it, if you don't want to do it on my website, you can do it on Yaron Brook Show. You can do it on subscribestar.com/YaronBrookShow.com/Yaron Brook Show. So subscribestar.com/Yaron Brook Show. I still have an account on Patreon, but I'm trying not to use it, although some of you refuse to leave Patreon, so I'm leaving it there just for the sake of those of you who don't want to leave it. And then somebody asked if I use Venmo. I do use Venmo, but I use Venmo for private stuff. I don't really have Venmo set up to take what I consider kind of business income. So I prefer, if you can, to go to Subscribestar or to go to use PayPal. And PayPal is set up to my business account, and then it's easier for me to keep track of. If there's no other way, email me or something, and we'll see if I can set up a Venmo business account. Maybe that's possible. I just don't know. Any upcoming interviews that I'm interviewing people? No, I haven't had time to set that up. But there is a interview that somebody else is interviewing me that will be released sometime in the not so distant future. It's big. It's somebody important interviewing me, or somebody big out there interviewing me. I'm not allowed to say who, and I'm not allowed to say when, but when it's close, i.e. within a couple of weeks, I will be letting you know of that interview. And that's going to be big, and I hope that when that happens, you all will promote it. Now, let me just say, because somebody asked earlier, did I pay to get to be interviewed by Dave Rubin? No, I did not pay. Dave invited me. I've been interviewed by Dave twice on his show. I did not pay for that. And this interview that's about to happen, I did not pay for. It too, I was invited to do the interview. And I think it was a good interview. I think it was a good interview. I think it will be, I think you'll be pleased. I hope you'll be pleased. Anyway, more on that coming up. In the meantime, don't forget to support the show, make all this stuff possible, all the stuff that we're doing possible, by going to subscribestar.com/YaronBrookShow or YaronBrookShow.com/support. And I'll see you all tomorrow. Talk to you soon. Bye, everybody.